Doug Wood is the founder and director of Americans for Responsible Technology, a national coalition of organizations working to push back against the unfettered deployment of the fifth-generation wireless infrastructure.
Hello, I'm Doug Wood, the founder and director of Americans for Responsible Technology and the associate director of Grassroots Environmental Education. Grassroots is a 501c3 nonprofit, science-based environmental health organization that deals with many of the environmental impacts that affect human health. I'm very happy to be here today to talk about building a national movement to push back against the deployment of 5G technology. So let's get started right away with a review of kind of how we got to where we are. This is kind of the timeline of the generations of wireless technology that have existed, going back to 1G. Some of you may be old enough to remember those analog phones in that picture, kind of bulky and not pretty, and certainly not capable of doing anything else except making a phone call. Those were analog phones. In 1991, we had our first digital phone. That was the 2G era. Again, capable pretty much just of making phone calls. A giant leap forward in 2001 with 3G, and there's the Apple iPhone. And all of a sudden, we were able to access the internet and do other amazing things. 4G came out in 2009 with video and all kinds of other fantastic things that it could do. And then all the way on the right there, you see the new 5G phone from Apple. And just below that, you'll see the 5G antenna, and you can see the difference in the infrastructure that was required for some of the older technology. And now what we're getting to is these smaller antennas, which are not as obtrusive, obviously, as the old ones, but it comes with a caveat. Let's look for a second, if we can, at what's different about 5G from our current 4G. The blue area that you see in your screen here is how an antenna distributes a 4G signal. It kind of goes in all directions, kind of roughly focused at down on the ground to where the users are, but it's a kind of a broad spectrum antenna covering a lot of area. That little red thing that you see is a 5G signal. That is a representation of what they call the focused beam technology. It's an on-demand kind of service, so 5G is always going to be a combination of both 4G and 5G. The 4G signal will be used to carry phone, text, data to a certain extent, and only when the phone needs a very concentrated blast of data will the phone request a 5G connection, and that's when that focused beam will be aimed directly at the device that's requesting it, and that it's a gigantic burst of energy will come through carrying all the data that's required. So again, 5G, it's important to remember 5G is always going to be 4G and 5G. These 5G waves don't travel as far as the 4G waves, and that's why the new 5G antennas need to be much closer to where people live, work, play, go to school, because the antenna needs to be close to where people are. As I say, the signal doesn't travel as far as the traditional 4G signal. It also doesn't go well through walls, even trees, even rain can get in the way. And so part of the requirement here for 5G is kind of a massive deployment of lots of antennas so that the signal can get through. Why is this a public health issue? Well, first of all, we have good science from 2G and 3G and even some 4G. Peer-reviewed studies, which I'm sure you have all heard about and many of you know about, kind of indicating how human biology is impacted by these wireless signals, this radio frequency microwave signals that travel through the air. The other thing that makes this a public health issue is simply the scope of deployment. Up to 1 million new antennas are going to be deployed, mostly in places where that are well inhabited. And we're crossing the line here from from a voluntary exposure, where you can decide how you want to be exposed to wireless radiation, whether that's holding your phone against your head or not, having a wireless router in your home or not, and other choices that you may make like that. We're now moving into an area of involuntary exposure, where if you live in an apartment or a home that's right near a 5G antenna, you don't have the choice of whether you're going to be exposed or not. You will be exposed 24/7, whether or not you're using the service. So this is kind of, from our perspective, crossing a line that we haven't crossed before in this country, where we are now exposing people to something which is a proven harm for the benefit of private companies. This is not about national security. This is not about a demonstrated public need. This is about something else. We'll talk about that in a little while. I want to go back for a moment and talk about the impact of the Telecommunications Act of 1996. In that act, it's funny the way the government frames these things and how legislators write laws. The law says all rights regarding the placement of antennas for telecommunications will reside with the local authorities, except, and then they go on to name all the things that are basically the things that govern the deployment of technology. And basically what happens is they take away many of the rights that local communities have had over how technology is going to be deployed in their own community. It's always been that communities had a fairly good say of where these things were going to be placed. Of course, we were talking about large antennas, 4G, 3G, 4G antennas. You know what I'm talking about. Those are the giant towers. And they could, place them in a place that wasn't so conspicuous. Certainly you would never put it next to a house if you could avoid it. And so local, there was some local control over that. Well, the 1996 Telecommunications Act pretty much wiped away the ability for local governments to have much control over that. The particularly onerous piece for us, and for many of you, I'm sure, is Section 704, which says that a local municipality cannot deny an antenna installation based on, quote, environmental effects, unquote. And that has been interpreted by the court to mean health effects. The Supreme Court has basically said, well, even though it says environmental effects, we're pretty sure that the legislature meant to include health effects with that. Many of us think that's ripe for another review. That first review came in 2001, so it was quite a long time ago. Now that we've got more and more science indicating or demonstrating biological harm from exposure to RF microwave radiation, we think that's ready for another challenge. So that is the effect of the Telecommunications Act. I want to talk a little bit about the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, the agency that's charged with overseeing the deployment of wireless infrastructure in this country. They've got two responsibilities in their charter. One is to try to help facilitate the easy deployment of technology so that people have access to the communications services that they want and need. And the other is to protect public health. it may not come as a surprise to many of you that the FCC doesn't actually have a health component of the agency. There's nobody actually looking at health. They turn around and point to the FDA and say, well, the FDA says it's okay, so it must be okay. And so they've kind of abdicated their responsibility there in terms of protecting health and push that off on other people. And we can talk about the FDA and how they've responded, which has not been a happy circumstance. There, in a report from Harvard University, they called the FCC a captured agency, which means that essentially the agency has been captured by the very industry that it's supposed to regulate. If you look at the background of many of the Federal Communication Commission members, they're all coming from the industry. They are former executives with Verizon and AT&T and other telecom related companies. So they're coming to this from the standpoint of how can we facilitate industry in promoting and exploiting their technology to the greatest extent possible. I always want to remind people that it is not the responsibility of corporations to protect public health. That's not their job. And if they do that at the expense of profits, those executives will be fired and they'll find other executives who won't do that. The purpose of business is to make money to exploit their technology to make money. It's government's job to be the buffer between industry on the one hand and the interests of the public on the other. And that's where the FCC has really fallen down on the job. They've pretty much abdicated their entire responsibility for trying to protect the public in favor of promoting, with your taxpayer dollars, promoting technology and exerting pressure on local governments to speed up the deployment of 5G. Whatever the 1996 telecommunications law left in terms of how local governments could control the deployment of this technology, the FCC has tried to wipe away with their various rulemakings and orders. I will remind you that FCC rulemakings and orders are not laws. They are the agency's interpretation of the law, and as such, they can be challenged. It's not often that the FCC gets rebuffed on its rulemakings, but it certainly has happened. And so I think local governments are right to push back against the FCC whenever they feel that the FCC has infringed on their rights. Local governments do set the rules, and there are some things that local governments can do. Most small cells today are being installed in the public right-of-way. The reason that they're being installed in the public right-of-way is quite simple. It's cheap. It's much cheaper to put a small cell antenna on Mr. Jones' property than it is to negotiate with some commercial property owner to put it there instead. So that's why we're seeing the telecoms go after the small cells in the public right-of-way. Not only that, but they can usually install these things on an existing telephone pole or utility pole and make a deal with the telephone company that drastically reduces their costs. It's much more expensive to have to put in your own pole than it is to just slap a 5G antenna on an existing pole. There are some state regulations. There are a number of states that have adopted what we call fast track legislation that kind of, again, wipes away many of the options that local communities have to set their own rules. But, you know, there are still things that local people can do to control the deployment of 5G small cell antennas. And here are some of the ones that we've been working with recently. We're encouraging local communities to put these items into their code. The first one is an insurance requirement. Most insurance liability policies exclude RF microwave radiation as a quote, pollutant, unquote. And the liabilities do not extend to any personal injury claim from RF microwave radiation. And so one of the things that we're encouraging local governments to do is to require telecoms to provide that insurance, that so that the town doesn't have any legal exposure here. We don't want the town to be on the hook if somebody files a lawsuit for personal injury because they've been exposed to this RF microwave radiation. It's difficult for the telecoms to get that insurance. And so, but we certainly think it's something that they should have. The next is a proof of gap in service. Here's one that I think may be the next thing that gets challenged with the FCC. The FCC has said that a telecom doesn't need to prove any gap in service. All they need to do is say, well, we want to have this for some future service. Well, you know, that kind of a blanket license for telecoms to come in where there's plenty of good local service, where it's not needed for anything that a phone can currently do, and say, well, we want to put in these small cells for things that may come up in the future, seems to us to be ripe for a challenge, that the FCC is exceeding its authority to do that. And there are already federal case laws that have established the fact that telecoms do need to prove some sort of lack of service before they can install their antennas. So again, that's one that's ready for a test. We always encourage municipalities to put into their code the requirement that no small cell can be installed in a residential area until and unless they can prove that there's no other viable alternative for them. We just went through this in my town, where they elected to put an antenna directly in front of someone's house, and our local code didn't include this provision. And it's too bad, because there was a municipal golf course right down the street, a much better place where they could have put the antenna. It would have saved the homeowners unbelievable amounts of agony and grief and distress, because they're so upset about this, this antenna that's literally going up 25 feet from their bedroom window. So requiring that the telecoms prove that this is the one and only place that they can put their antenna is something that we think should be in every code. Random testing to ensure compliance. You know, once they put the antennas up and turn them on, nobody comes around to check to see if they're within the FCC exposure guidelines. And as you know, these things always work better. The more power you put in, the greater area they'll cover, and the more efficient they're going to be. And so, you know, routinely, manufacturers and telecoms, you know, ramp it up to 11 so that they've got a great service and everybody's happy. Whether or not this may exceed the FCC guidelines for public exposure, as inadequate as those guidelines may be, and I can already hear people saying, well, gee, you know, those exposure levels from the FCC are not really protective, and I agree 100% with that. But at the very least, for the moment, we ought to make sure that the antennas that are being put up fulfill the requirement to be within those guidelines, not only for the first small cell antenna that goes up, but for all collated equipment combined. And that's a very important thing. That you can't just put up your one antenna, measure your antenna, and say, well, my antenna is okay. We want to see that all of the antennas that happen to be on that particular location do not, in the aggregate, exceed the RF exposure limits. And then, of course, there are the aesthetic concerns about how the antenna looks, what it's going to look like from the perspective of local homeowners, and so on. So there are things that you can put into your code to make sure that it's not going to be an unsightly burden or change the look of your community. When it comes to building public support and influencing public opinion, there are a number of things that Americans for Responsible Technology and our kind of what I call the retail site, which is 5gcrisis.com, a number of things that we have created to help you build some support for this in your community. The first is our neighborhood letter, which is a very kind of simple ABC of this is what's coming. If you don't know about it, here are the basics of 5G technology and why you should be concerned about it. A letter to the editor. Not every town has a hometown newspaper, but if you do, it's a really good way to get the information out there and to encourage other people to contact you about this if they are concerned. What we find is that there are always people in the community, especially the parents of young children, who are concerned about this constant involuntary exposure and the fact that they won't be able to turn it off. That is a very, very concerning thing to people. And so this letter to the editor kind of, again, outlines those kinds of issues. We've got ideas for building your organization and how to encourage people to join up with you. There's a lot of stuff about social media and so on. As ironic as it is, we use a lot of social media to help people organize their groups and stay in touch with each other. We've created professional-looking posters and signs that you can use at demonstrations. I'm sure if you've seen some of the coverage of 5G demonstrations, you've seen many of our signs there. A lot of people take our ideas and do their own signs, which is great. We're not doing this to try to make a business out of it. We're trying to help people with ideas and so on. We've also got some information about talking to the press. And one of the things that we find that's very important in terms of influencing public opinion is that we try to speak with a common language and that we're using the same kinds of arguments time after time after time. Those of you who are into politics know that it's one thing that the Republican Party in particular is really good at doing, and that is following the message and making sure that they're always repeating those talking points over and over and over. And if we do that, I think it really does help to kind of coalesce public opinion around certain ideas and so on. So talking to the press is really important. The press can be our friend or it can be our enemy, and depending on how we present our arguments to the press, I think they can be very helpful. And of course, lobbying local officials. We've got information on there for people who've never done any lobbying before, who have never actually requested a meeting, sat down with people, even over Zoom. How to conduct those kinds of meetings with the greatest result is something that we've always thought was important. And so we have information there, again, to help people do that. The bottom line to all of this, from our perspective, from an environmental health perspective, this is really important. And I try to repeat this in all of our meetings and in all of our communications. For the past 25 or 30 years, all regulation and all legislation in this country that is in regards to wireless radiation starts with the idea that non-ionizing radio frequency radiation is harmless. Every politician we've talked to in Washington and in state capitals believes this to be true because they've been told over and over and over by the telecom industry. There's just no science here. There's no truth to it. Senator, you don't need to worry about this because it's fringe science. There's nothing there. You don't have to believe it. And so we use the study from the NTP, a government sponsored, gold, not gold plated, what's the word? A gold standard study that was designed in part with the wireless industry. They helped, design how that study was going to be done. And the study was unequivocal in its results, which is, the study was designed to find out whether or not, once and for all, can we please find out whether or not radiation from cell phones increases the risk of cancer? And the answer was, yes, absolutely it does, unequivocally. And of course, that was echoed a few months later with the Ramazzini Institute study showing that the same disease endpoints were showing up in exposure to distant cell towers. Those two studies are certainly not the only studies showing harm, but they're recent studies and they are government-sponsored studies, and they're very helpful in helping us push back against this notion that radio frequency radiation is harmless. And we now claim that that notion has been proven false. And now the question is, what is government going to do about it? What are the telecoms going to do about it? What are legislatures going to do about it? What are the courts going to do about it? The other thing that I want to emphasize is we are up against arguably one of the largest corporations and industries that has ever existed on the face of the earth. It's a gigantic multi-trillion-dollar industry. And the only thing that will beat their money, and they've got a lot of it, and they know how to use it in Washington and other places, the only thing that beats that is public opinion. And so we are focused on building awareness of the science around wireless radiation, its impacts on human health and the environment. We are very confident in our studies and in the science that's there and the science that continues to develop. It certainly isn't going the other way. We just happen to be in a foot race. Can we get to enough members of the public and get them to understand the risks of wireless radiation exposure before the telecoms have succeeded in blanketing the country with 5G? And that's still a question that's out there. I will leave you with this quote that I really love. There's the quote that's been attributed to Gandhi, but I like this one better. All truth passes through three steps. First, it is ridiculed. Second, it is violently opposed. And third, it is accepted as self-evident. And we're hoping that through our work and with our more than 150 organizations across 43 states, that we will be able to build public opinion against the unfettered deployment of 5G technology and finally get to a public realization that wireless radiation is not harmless and that we need to take steps to protect everyone, especially our most vulnerable populations, our children, the elderly, people with particular sensitivities, and so on. So that is our work. That's what we are happy to be doing, and very pleased at the success that we've had. All credit going to our local friends across the country who have started their organizations and succeeded in moving public opinion in their communities. This is not something that we can do. This is something that we completely rely on local people to do, and our job is to help them do it. So thank you very much for your attention.